It's 2:01, so still waiting. I'll still give attendees a few more minutes, but while we're waiting, I will go ahead and announce this. I may announce it again. Again, welcome to the Metro Atlanta Library Association Fall Webinar. I'm Mark Coltrane, the president of Metro Atlanta Library Association. We'll get to our presentation in just a moment, but a couple of really quick announcements from MLA. One is that stay tuned for details on our December event. We normally have events throughout the year that culminate with our conference in June, but we are excited about our December event, which will be happening at the Morrison branch of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Public Library. We'll have more details about that, but that will involve a tour of that very nice, fancy new facility. Details forthcoming. We also have elections coming up, so we're actually looking to fill 2 positions on our executive board, the treasurer position and the vice president position. So if you're interested in becoming a part of Metro Atlanta, we would love it if you would sign up or throw your hat into the ring to run for treasurer or vice president. Vice president is a 3-year commitment, and the treasurer position is a 2-year commitment. And Michael Weinkauf, our immediate past president, just sent an email out about that this week. If you'd like more details about that, let me know. I will put my email into the chat box so you can get more questions about that or check our website. Also, we have positions on our at-large board, and those are fewer responsibilities, but you still are required to join one of our wonderful committees to plan for the conference or other events. We'll focus on membership. So we would love it if you consider becoming an at-large member of the Metro Atlanta board or throw your hat into the ring for treasurer or vice president. And it's 2:03, so I'll wait another moment. We had quite a few people sign up and only 25. I still see people are trickling in, so I want to make sure that everyone is in the room. And if anyone, hopefully, I assume everyone can hear me. We did a sound check a few moments ago. Really appreciate you all coming today. All right. In the interest of time, I do want to give our presenters the full amount of time. So we will get started. Again, I'm Mark Coltrane, president of Metro Atlanta. Welcome to our second fall webinar. We typically have a fall event. This is the second year in a row we've done a webinar. And we're really excited to have Natalie Ornat, the humanities librarian at UNC Charlotte, and her colleague Amanda Binder, the social sciences and history librarian from UNC Charlotte, with us to present on Crit Lib in the classroom, incorporating critical information literacy into instruction. It is a very interesting topic, and we're very lucky for them to share about their good work. So I will turn it over to them, and I'll also, if you have any technical issues, feel free to chat with me in the chat box, and I'll try to help you the best I can. But otherwise, I'll turn it over to Amanda and Natalie. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark, and thank you to the Metro Atlanta Library Association for inviting us to give this webinar today. This is kind of a follow-up to a presentation that we did for the annual conference earlier this summer, which we've received a lot of great feedback on, so we're excited to present it to maybe a wider audience today. On the screen, but you can see us here. So again, I'm Natalie Ornat. I'm the humanities librarian here at UNC Charlotte. So I work with a couple of different departments on campus. I work with the Department of English, Religious Studies, Philosophy, and Languages and Culture Studies.
And hello, I'm Amanda Binder. I'm the Social Sciences and History Librarian at UNC Charlotte. So I am a subject librarian working with the areas of history as well as political science and Latin American studies. And I also coordinate the Atkins Fellows Program, which is a paid summer fellowship that we offer to current library and information science students and recent graduates for work opportunities in academic libraries.
And we were just going to kind of start out, too, by saying how we first learned about the term critical information literacy and where we kind of heard about it for the first time. So I'll just share that I am kind of still an early career librarian and heard about this term when I was actually at UNC Chapel Hill with some friends. We were doing mock job talks and giving each other feedback. And I had a friend who now works at Berry College who was talking about this term in relation to her teaching philosophy. And I had never really heard the concept before, but realized pretty quickly that I was already kind of incorporating some of these elements into my teaching while I was a grad student at Chapel Hill, and was really kind of drawn to the underlying values of this practice.
And I think I first probably heard about this term, critical information literacy, through Twitter. So just some people that I was following were talking about this term, using this term, and then there were online discussions on Twitter related to this term. So that was probably my first introduction to the concept. So we thought we would get the webinar started with just a little bit of interaction with all of you. So we were curious to know, what are your perceptions of this term, critical information literacy? And this could be just, definitions that you've heard or just kind of your understanding of the term. And if you could just use the chat box and enter some responses to that question, just so we can get a sense of what people might already think about the term. So we'll get started with that question. We're not seeing any responses yet, but certainly it's not maybe a one-word answer to that question. So any ideas that you have that you want to enter in the chat box, just to give us a sense of maybe your perceptions of the term. Maybe you learned about the term the same way that I did, just hearing about it on Twitter or some other social media channel, or maybe you've heard about it from a colleague or a friend or another a student that you're working alongside.
Or if this is the first time you've heard the term, then let us know that too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. We have some coming into the chat right now. Kristen's talking with students about thinking critically about their searching and sources that they find. Absolutely. And Julie has shared information literacy with a social justice bent. Absolutely. Okay, and Liz is talking about still not being totally familiar with the concept, but forward-thinking and responsive approach to information literacy that would incorporate digital and internet literacy, giving people agency to engage critically. Fantastic. And Ron has added, determining what is a good source.
Yeah, so we just kind of wanted to gauge what everyone was thinking so far about the topic and kind of what their knowledge was so far as we move into our talk today.
Thanks for sharing your responses. Okay, so in the next hour, this is what we're going to go over during the webinar. So we will, Natalie will be defining the term critical information literacy to give everyone a common grounding in what we mean by that term. And then we're going to talk about practices of critical information literacy in the classroom, which is the title of our presentation. We'll have a moment for a group activity that we'll do through chat, just to check in with all of you again and get your ideas. And then we'll be talking about challenges of incorporating critical information literacy into the classroom. We will provide recommended resources and learning opportunities to learn more about this topic. And then we'll finally talk about creating and participating in a community of practice surrounding this topic. And we'll end with questions. So that just gives you a good overview of what you can expect in the next hour of the webinar. And while we're talking, we thought we'd give you some questions to chew on. So first of all, how could you begin incorporating crit-lib practices into your own work? What challenges might you face and how could you overcome these challenges? And then finally, thinking of a lesson that you are currently working on and maybe how could you incorporate this practice into your current instruction? So these are just some questions to think of as we're talking about the concept and examples that we'll provide from our own experience with our practice.
So the first thing that we were going to talk about is just a way to define critical information literacy and to think about it. So crit-lib is both a theory and a practice. So it's a way of thinking about information literacy as a whole and looking at the societal forces that shape these issues. So it's a lens through which we can consider the work that we're doing with our own students and with the communities that we're placed within as well. So it can be a set of general guidelines that can be put into practice. And particularly within instruction, it allows us to challenge students to really think critically about ways that information is created, distributed, organized, and accessed. So we can kind of hit the different points of the information process from beginning to end. So a lot of you might have heard about it through the hashtag #CritLib conversations that happen on Twitter. And there's a lot of interest currently on critical information literacy. There's a lot of scholarship that's been coming out, in the past 10 years or so. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of resources that actually describe classroom situations and contexts in which this practice takes place. So with this webinar, we're really just kind of hoping to share some of our experiences incorporating this theory. We're by no means experts in this, but to share our experiences and kind of start a dialogue on how others might be able to incorporate the practice as well. So the ideas of crit-lib can really be traced to some other influential pedagogical theories and paradigms, which help to give a foundation to the theory. So I'm going to be talking just briefly about two today, critical pedagogy and feminist pedagogy. So critical pedagogy, the pioneer of this, you might have heard of Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. And in this work, Freire works to kind of replace this idea of a banking concept of learning. And what he means by the banking concept is seeing classrooms operating like a bank. So having teachers viewed as kind of the classroom authority who owns the knowledge and deposits it into the heads of students to use for their own profit and success. And so instead, he was advocating for a shift from a more teacher-centered to a student-centered environment where students are active producers of knowledge. Henry Giroux was another critical pedagogy scholar, discussed the importance of empowering students to be problem posers and engage in a culture of questioning. And then under these circumstances, knowledge is seen as something that's really both transformational to students and then also the society that the student exists in. And then feminist pedagogy also resists this banking concept of learning and really seeks to foster open discussion, critical inquiry, and consciousness raising in education. And there's an emphasis that our learning is rooted in our social position and therefore must involve values of freedom, social justice, and participation. And the feminist approach really cares that the learner or about what the learner does, not just within the classroom, but outside of the classroom as well. So it's helping to create not just critical thinkers, but individuals who act critically upon the world and their community. So I wanted to show you just a couple of different quotes that discuss and try and kind of define what critical information literacy is that have come out within the past couple of years. So these are just some definitions that I've personally come across that I think kind of help to show a range of how we can define this and some of the different aspects of this theory. And they also show that some definitions are a little bit more active than others. And within this, we can also kind of see where it aligns with our own values and mission in this discipline. So the first quote, Gregory and Higgins, they specify some of the different systems that we can be critical of. So social, political, economic, and corporate. And it breaks down the different parts of the information process that all of these things can influence. So one example of this, we could look at the political impact of information access using the example of the Environmental Protection Agency. So right after the 2016 election, the Trump administration made changes to the EPA's website that reduced access to information on climate change, where even the archived page had missing PDFs and broken links. So we can see this as kind of an example of political impact on accessing information, especially government information, which I think we tend to communicate to students as being fairly neutral and authoritative. We can look at the economics of information production when we talk about the researching and publishing industry, where there's a very real price to be a part of the scholarly communication, which may help exclude underrepresented groups from the scholarly communication or scholarly conversation. And then in the middle here, Eamon Toole's definition really connects CritLib with principles from feminist pedagogy, where education works to create social change and empowers learners to identify and act upon oppressive social structures, which can definitely be seen as more of an active approach. And then the last one, Jonathan Cope, emphasizes more of the active learning aspect and practice of critical questioning from both teachers and students. And this approach, no doubt, has us turn a critical eye towards academic scholarship as well. So as librarians, I think that we sometimes place academic scholarship on quite a pedestal. You probably had in your classroom conversations about scholarly and popular articles, and I think sometimes it's easy for us to leave having communicated that scholarly equals good and trustworthy, and popular equals bad and untrustworthy. But using a critical approach, we can have a more nuanced conversation on authority, on how different conversations play out in different realms of information, on voices that are left out of the scholarly conversation. And I think this quote really helps inspire this idea of critical questioning on different types of information. And I think we could also even replace this term academic scholarship with information systems. And in a classroom, you could examine perhaps a library catalog or a database and analyze how there are biases attached to their production, looking at such things as algorithms and controlled vocabulary. So how does this actually play out then in the classroom, right? What does it start to look like? So it's a move away from more technical demonstration models of instruction. It's a move away from being more teacher-led, where you have the instructor, talking for 45 minutes straight. And it's also a move away from these blanket labelings of authority, just because something is peer-reviewed or written by an academic. And it's a move to a classroom that's more student-centered, where the instructor takes on more of a facilitator role, and where real relevant problems are posed to and by students, and a dialogue happens for students to collectively generate insight and knowledge and question the information that they're using. So the next part of our presentation, Amanda and I are just going to try and give some specific examples of ways that, again, we've tried to incorporate this in our classrooms. We've broken it down by a couple of different specific strategies that we've attempted to use to incorporate it. So the first one being student-centered. This, for me, I've always tried to create a very student-centered classroom. I used to teach sixth grade before this, so that was kind of something that was a given. You couldn't talk 50 minutes straight to sixth graders, and you would not be very successful. So in my student-centered classroom, I like to try and turn the tables and have students explore and then explain concepts back to the class. So I use an activity called the jigsaw method. And this is just when you have students in a group or individually take pieces of something to analyze, learn about, and then they take that and report back to the full group, effectively kind of piecing back together a puzzle, and then you as a whole group have learned something new about that. So you could do this with the research process, with parts of a database, the library website, anything that you could really kind of chunk apart into different pieces. So for a class where our learning objective was to better understand the components and conventions of a scholarly article, I broke up a scholarly article by different sections and gave each group a section with guided questions. And then they reported back to the full group explaining what type of information this section held and how it is helpful to them as researchers. So students really had to take ownership over the different sections and then kind of work to teach their classmates this as well. The second one, so problem posing, many of us have probably come into instruction sessions with an example topic already in mind. So when I'm showing students how to maybe use a database or formulate keywords, I'll try and center my example on an issue that's both relevant to the class and the world and lives the students are living in. So for example, actually for this same class where we did the jigsaw activity, it was actually a class of student athletes that was very male-dominated class. So knowing this, I purposely chose our model or example article to be one discussing the marginalization of female sports and sports reporters on college campuses. So that was really an opportunity for them to become exposed to a problem that they might not have ever thought about or really talked about before amongst, teammates and amongst their peers. So they were not only still practicing this activity and building this skill, but also being exposed to this issue. That is very relevant to them. Just one other example, in a class where we were crafting research questions, I had an example research question that the class practiced building keywords off of. And that question was, what are solutions to solve the racial segregation occurring in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools, which is the public school system here in Charlotte. So again, kind of bringing into the classroom space a very local problem that they might be aware of, they might not be aware of. So we're not explicitly, talking about this, but in them coming up with keywords and kind of practicing some beginning parts of the research process on this, they do have to kind of, parse out what this problem is and different components of it. So we really do hold a lot of power in the examples that we use. And then discussion and dialogue, probably something that you're already undertaking in your teaching. I like to focus questions on issues of authority, representation, and access. So I have a information timeline activity that I do with students where we look at different types of information, such as tweets, newspaper articles, GovDocs, and scholarly articles. And they have to answer questions like, what gives this source authority? Who holds power in producing this information? Whose voices are included? Whose are left out? What power structures have enabled this author to have authority? And you get a lot of really different answers, obviously, for if you're talking about a tweet or a book or a New York Times article, but it leads to a really interesting conversation and one that I found that students are really excited to have.
Okay, so this is Amanda. I'm going to share some examples from classes that I've worked with and different activities, ways that I've interpreted critical information literacy and incorporated those concepts and ideas into my classes. So the first type of example I have is a student-centered approach, just like Natalie had an example. Because I work with the history department, a lot of my instruction with history students is talking about how to find primary source materials, but I also like to incorporate ways to think about critically engaging with primary sources. So one activity that I've done is related to students critically evaluating historical newspaper articles that they discover. So the activity will break the students into smaller groups and have them read articles from different newspapers that cover the same event, and to so that they get a sense that newspapers are not just neutral sources. They have their own perspectives, and I think oftentimes, or too often, when I meet with students, I'll see them interpreting information from popular news media as facts. And so this activity has them critically engaging with media. So in the context of this activity, I would be doing it more with a historical topic, so not a contemporary topic. But I could see taking this type of activity and doing it with a historical event, and then maybe applying it to something that's happening more recently in the news. So again, it's having the students question authority in some of the sources that they may consider to be fact, and really having more of a nuanced understanding of how information is created, so that they can apply this, even if we're looking at historical topic, they can apply those same concepts to evaluating more popular news sources that they may rely upon for information. The other example I had, and just as Natalie mentioned, the search examples that we use in the classroom to demonstrate resources can often expose students to interesting topics and help connect history to the present. So one example that I have used with classes on Cold War history and African American history has been the use of African American athletes during the Cold War to represent global understandings of race relations in the United States during that time period. So even just the examples that I use, even if I'm just trying to search how to use JSTOR, for example, I can, again, the power that we have as librarians in terms of the search examples that we use can really connect to students. So I think the example that I use with that can really connect to more contemporary issues as well, and conversations around race relations and global perspectives on race. So that's another example of using my search example, kind of exposing students to various topics that might interest them and connecting history to the present. And then my final example is connecting to dialogue. So again, looking at discussions of representation and authority and sources. So history as a concept looks at historiography, which is historians' interpretations of history over time. And so I meet with students in their historiography class, and I think that the concept, the fact that students in history are really looking at not just history as fact, but looking to see who wrote this interpretation of history and understanding how it has changed over time, gives a good sense of questioning authority and really having, again, more nuanced understanding of authority and how we talk about scholarly sources. One of the examples that I've used with some classes would be government or even commercial propaganda films. The Prelinger Archives, which is accessible through the Internet Archive, I've used several of their videos as a way to engage students in the idea of propaganda. So when I was meeting with a class of students about the Bracero program of the 40s, 50s, and 60s, I had the students watch a video made by the California Growers Association that justified the guest worker program that legally employed millions of migrant Mexican laborers. And in the video, you hear some of the same language that we might hear today about migrant laborers working in the United States. So again, using a film and trying to have the students kind of engage with the topic and kind of connect what's happening in a historical event and in that propaganda film to more contemporary issues that we hear about today. So those are some of the examples that I've used with classes. One thing that I've been thinking of more recently is ways to engage students in activities that have them thinking about deconstructing language. So encouraging students to critically analyze current real-world terms that we use. And one example is, fake news that we use probably all the time. Instructors are probably using it with their students, and they're certainly reading about it all of the time in the news. So, creating an activity where students have to research where does that term come from, what are the benefits of using that term, and then also what are some of the dangers of using that term. So making the students more aware of terms that they might hear about in their everyday lives. Another term I was thinking about could be woke. So things, terms that are commonly referred to in the mainstream media and in social media that students might encounter, and then working with students in activities in the classroom to deconstruct those terms and just be more critically engaged with the history of terms and the power of terms and how our use of those terms impacts our own understanding of them, but also others' understanding of them. So those are just some examples that Natalie and I had for activities. And we'd certainly love to hear from you if you have other ideas for activities. But we thought we'd try to work on an example together during the webinar. So we thought about, since we're assuming many of our attendees were coming from Charlotte, but we have heard that there's a much wider scope in participation. But we thought we could just collectively as a group in the webinar work about or think about what are problems or social issues occurring in Charlotte that could be the basis for CritLib instruction. So you could just enter your ideas into the chat box, and it looks like we already have one, that Charlotte has a major issue with economic mobility. Yes. So absolutely, that's a great example. Oh, another economic mobility. Okay. We have police, community relations, absolutely. Race relations. Okay. So there's obviously a lot of various social issues addressing or that we're encountered with in our community in Charlotte. And certainly it's not unique to Charlotte, but I think that we find a lot of times that students really connect to where they're living, and they like to talk about topics that they might see in their own city or they might see in their own neighborhood. So definitely using some of these examples. Gentrification came up, preservation as a relate to intellectual freedom.
Statutes and preservation, yeah, there's
statutes, yeah,
yeah,
thank you.
Yeah.
The bathroom bill, absolutely. Okay, so those were all really great examples. So you could take any of those social issues, impacting Charlotte and use those as the basis for CritLib instruction in many forms. So it could be using, for example, news articles related to those topics. And then I think if we scroll over, one of the examples I was thinking, again, relating to the power of language was thinking about the interpretations by various news sources, local and global, of the aftermath of the Keith Lamont Scott shooting in Charlotte, and how language impacts our understanding of events. So, for those of you that were following that when it was happening or were living here in Charlotte, we would see news articles that use various different terminology to describe what was happening in the aftermath. So maybe protest was used as a term, but also we saw demonstration, uprising, and also riot. And each of those terms has very different meanings and also brings about different feelings and perceptions that people might have. So I think that would be a good example to use with students to think about kind of the power of language and how we should be careful with the language that we use and the responsibility that comes with communication of news sources, but even communication that we have of each other. even terms and movements like Black Lives Matter that we hear so often should be discussed as well. So that would be another example of where does that term come from, and just kind of grounding students in the history of current conversations that we have and terms that we hear regularly in news sources. Okay.
And I'll just add something in relating to Black Lives Matter as well, and the types of sources too that are available. You know, there might be topics that students are interested in researching where, you know, scholarly articles, there might not be a lot available on that topic. Obviously Black Lives Matter has been around for, you know, quite some time, so there have been a range of scholarly articles that have come out on that. But, you know, discussing and trying to have conversations too about alternative media or alternative sources that we might not traditionally be labeling as authoritative, you know, that's coming out from some of, you know, activist research that we can look at too.
Okay, so then we thought we'd take a moment and thank you to everyone who participated in our little activity. We thought now we talk about some of the challenges that we face and that people can, or librarians can face when trying to incorporate critical information literacy into library instruction. So the first one that we thought of was the one-shot instruction model, which is very common. Many librarians are still doing one-shot instruction. I know I still do a lot of one-shot instruction. And one of the challenges with the one-shot model is that you only have so much time to meet with the students, or you have a limited amount of time to meet with students. So you may be forced to choose between demonstrating a resource like a database or showing students how to search. So choosing between that or engaging the students in a CritLib activity and conversation like some of the examples that we just provided. So CritLib activities can take time, especially when you're having students break out into groups and have conversations and come back together. They could really take up the entire sessions that you might have with a student. So one way around this may be the flipped instruction approach, where students could learn about how to search for materials from a video tutorial or an online learning module that you may create. And this frees up your time with the students for deeper engagement in these types of conversations and activities that we've just been talking about. Another challenge that could be faced would be faculty expectations. So related to one-shot instruction, faculty may have limited expectations of what they think library sessions are or what librarians can do to help their students. And so this may be a new concept of them, of you taking on this role of engaging the students in this type of conversation. And so one way around this would be to try to schedule a meeting with a faculty member to explain the different types of activities that you can engage in with students and your goals for those activities. And if they still want you to help with demonstrating how to search for resources, you can suggest that they assign the students to maybe watch a video tutorial, et cetera, as I mentioned with the first example, and create a worksheet that the students have to complete after watching the video to ensure that they engage with the online materials. So again, just kind of trying to explain different options that are available for library instruction, and if faculty still are concerned with students learning how to search, presenting different opportunities and options that, again, take on more of the hybrid model. And finally, student expectations for library instruction. Students may also have their own expectations for a library session. They could be expecting you to lecture to them or just demonstrate resources without any expectation for their own engagement in the process. So one way to ease them into the session is to present your learning objectives for the session and explain what you will be doing in class, just to prepare them for what the session will be like in case it's different than what they expected. And then finally have them work in groups so that they feel supported in the activity. So if a lot of their class is not very much discussion, it's mostly lecture, breaking them up into groups doesn't put as much pressure on them to kind of come up with answers or questions on their own. They have the group environment to help them through the process.
So You're not convinced already. So why would you go about incorporating CritLib practices into your instruction? So a CritLib classroom is fundamentally an active learning classroom where students are really actively creating knowledge together. And we're able to encourage students to be active participants in and contributors to our information world when we're doing this kind of instruction. So when they better understand the full process that information undertakes, along with these structural pressures that are impacting this information process, I think they're better equipped to participate in the information world as a student, and then both when they leave the classroom environment and go back to their everyday lives. So students can go beyond just thinking critically also to acting critically upon their world and then also the communities that they're in. And I did also see a study that was mentioned in a piece on critical information literacy instruction that student engagement is shown to increase with this critical IL approach. And I think that that really relies on when you're using these real-world relevant problems in the classroom. It just makes sense that students are going to be more engaged if you're using, or the topic for discussion is something that they're invested in, that they maybe see themselves or they see their community within, and something that they themselves can also kind of discuss and contribute to.
So what we have listed on the screen are some resources that we have found helpful to learn more about this concept. As we've already mentioned, we are by no means experts on this topic. We have read and we have researched, and we try to put what we learn into practice and kind of experiment, try new things in our instruction, and find ways to incorporate this into our instruction. But these are some excellent resources that we have relied upon. There's several books that are listed on there. There is the hashtag CritLib on Twitter. So if you are on Twitter but you're not following CritLib yet, certainly think about following CritLib. They do have Twitter chats organized through critlib.org, and these are kind of organized conversations on Twitter relating to this topic. So the hashtag and the chats are really just a way of building a community, different people that are also trying to incorporate this, and then everyone just learning from each other. And ACRL has organized the instruction session, 5 things you should read about critical information literacy. So I believe these slides will be shared later on, and you can click on that link. Some other formal learning opportunities, you can look out for workshops that might be offered. There was a workshop, I don't know, I can't think of the date of that, but it says fall 2018, so it's either happened or happening, but it's on special collections in university archives. And so obviously there's a lot of different aspects to this topic. So just be on the lookout for those. ALA has offered a course in the past on Introduction to Critical Information Literacy. So just be looking out for different opportunities for learning. Certainly, hopefully this workshop helped, or this webinar helped just to kind of get started with some of these ideas, but we wanted to provide some examples of other opportunities that may be available. And one of the things that we did, Natalie and I did after our presentation this summer at Metrolina, is we wanted to create a community of local librarians in the Charlotte area that were interested in critical information literacy to connect and create a dialogue, a local dialogue, so that we could talk with each other about our experiences, share ideas for each other, and just learn from each other. So this is kind of in addition to the communities that may already exist online, like as we see through Twitter. So we formed a CritLib community of practice as a space to share positive and negative experiences, ask questions, exchange lesson activities, share resources, and ultimately further develop our knowledge and practice of CritLib. So we will put into the chat box a link so that if any of you are interested, see if I can get to it. If any of you are interested in joining you want to take over? In joining us. We've only met once. We met earlier this fall, and we met at Amelie's, which is a local coffee shop here in Charlotte, if you don't live in Charlotte. And we had a really nice conversation. We shared ideas, and we'd like to just continue those conversations. So the form that we just put in the chat box is a way to just join our local CritLib group. So we hope that some of you will be interested in joining us, and we hope to have another meeting near the end of this fall semester.
Yeah. So Valerie, I see that you asked when the next meetup is. So yeah, we're still gonna, I think we're gonna put out a request and call for dates that folks would be available to meet, just to see some options if folks are available to set that next date.
Yeah. And then there is also a listserv that we've created so that people can also converse with each other about these topics online when we're not meeting in person. So it could be, sharing an interesting article that you've read or asking a question of the group. So not all the activity has to happen in the in-person meeting. We can still have communication outside of that. But it's just something that we're trying out. So we do hope that some of you who are interested would fill out the form and join our group. We'd love to have some more people join us. And we know that there are participants in the webinar from other areas of the state and beyond. So maybe think about joining or creating a community of practice in your own area, maybe one that already exists, or just creating one. We found it to be, just even in our first meeting, I thought it was really helpful. And we're just kind of excited to be able to network with other librarians in our area that share common interests.
Yeah. So the last slide that we had, if you have any questions, please feel free to send us them through the chat box, or again, if you had any, spark of an idea while you were listening to this, or, kind of are trying some things out in your own instruction, feel free to share that as well. I think everyone would love to see that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I see, Kelsey, you asked previously, are there any similar groups in other places that you know of? I don't know of a central list that has different meetups in different locations. I don't think could see that being in a place like critlib.org, but I don't think I've actually seen that place on the site. But I think if you try to connect with folks maybe over Twitter with that hashtag, from my experience, the folks who are participating in that hashtag are very generous with their responses too. Yeah. So they might have an idea.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah. And do you have any lesson plans to share? Yeah, I mean, I'm always happy to share lesson plans that I'm doing. That's, I think, a space, if you're in Charlotte and able to join our community of practice, as Amanda was saying, we kind of have a listserv or a Google group.
Right.
So that's kind of one space where we can share lesson plans, files, or whatnot. But I'm always happy to, to share it individually with folks over email.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Laura, I think that's a great idea, and it's actually something that we talked about at our first meeting of our local CritLib group, was thinking about how to incorporate the public libraries into these conversations and do more partnership with them. Certainly public libraries are doing so much to address social issues in our areas, and incorporating them into these conversations is absolutely important. Definitely reaching beyond just the academic library audience or the university audience, because these are important topics, certainly not just for college students, but for people of all ages. We even talked about incorporating some of the school librarians who are working with K-12 students as well, and kind of collaborating so that this kind of conversation is happening, through the whole progression of somebody's, beginning in school, all the way through college and into adulthood as well. So that's a great point. And I'm going to move our slide over to the next one, which also has our contact information. So if you do want to follow up with any of us, like maybe you're not interested in joining the group, but you have other follow-up questions that you think of later on and you'd rather just send them to us directly, feel free to email either or both of us. And we are both on Twitter as well if you are, so you can follow us there and join us in some conversations in that venue as well.
I see Kelsey asked a really great question. Wondering if we have techniques to get students to talk to each other when they might just not want to. So when you're actually getting a discussion going. Yeah, and I think this can be really difficult, particularly if you're doing this within like a one-shot and you haven't seen the students before and you haven't really, there's just not enough time in a one-shot to kind of sometimes develop the trust and develop the rapport for students to, really give a piece of themselves in the discussion section that you plan. But I think, if it's the first time that you're seeing them, sometimes, like you mentioned, breaking them up into groups or doing something like a think, pair, share, where they're speaking with somebody, they're thinking themselves first, silently, to themselves, and then talking to someone next to them, which is, maybe actually someone that they know or a friend or they're comfortable with, and then sharing with the class, or having them, take 5 minutes of just like journaling, and writing it down that way and getting their thoughts on paper. But yeah, that definitely is a problem with asking those questions and then hearing crickets. So sometimes I'll take the question and I'll break it down. I'll try and frame it maybe in a new way or ask a smaller question and kind of to see if, then we can get a response to build off of.
Yeah. And I think another option is just, students may be intimidated coming into the library if they haven't had a library session before. And then you're asking them to with some serious questions sometimes.
Yeah. So
like you could also do an icebreaker, something that they could easily answer. Maybe it's just something personal about themselves, but it gets them feeling a little bit more comfortable in the environment that they're in the library. And then you can, once they're kind of laughing or just kind of joking with each other, and feeling more uncomfortable in the space, we can kind of move them into deeper discussions that we want to engage them with in the classroom.
Any other questions for Natalie or Amanda? Well, thank you all for attending, and apologies. I know we had a few WebEx shenanigans off and on throughout the hour, but thank you all for being patient and rolling with them. But again, this webinar was recorded, and a link will be sent out. If not today, then certainly by the end of the week. And again, thank you, Natalie and Amanda. Great presentation, great information. So for those of you out on WebEx, please don't hesitate to reach out to them if you have questions.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks, Metrolina, and thanks to all of you for participating today and joining us for our session. We really enjoyed talking with you and hope to hear from you again.
Thanks, guys.
Great. Thanks all. Lots of thank yous in the chat box. So, and again, one last reminder, don't forget our December event. We will be sending more information out about that very soon. And also, if you'd like to participate in Metrolina, we have 2 positions that will be up for election, the treasurer position and the vice president position. And also we have at-large board positions available as well. So if you have questions about that, I'm entering my email into the chat box right now. Please email me. All right, thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon. Some people, when they sign